New Jersey, the Garden State. Suburban towns, shore boardwalks, quiet neighborhoods where everybody knows everybody. It looks like the last place you'd expect a nightmare. But the women in this documentary shattered that illusion. They weren't strangers in the shadows. They were wives, mothers, daughters, and neighbors. The people you'd never think to fear, right up until it was too late. Every case you're about to see is real. Every victim was real. And every one of these women ended up in a New Jersey courtroom, facing what she'd done. Quick thing before we start, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. We've got a community all over the world, and if you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we drop a new true crime documentary every week. So stay with us, because in New Jersey, the most dangerous person in the room was often the one you'd least suspect. Melanie Maguire, 2004.
How do you find us to the count of the indictment charging Melanie Maguire with the murder of William Maguire between on or about April 28, 2004 and on or about May 5, 2004 in the township of Woodbridge, Middlesex County, New Jersey, elsewhere and within the jurisdiction of this court?
Guilty.
On May 5, 2004, a fisherman near the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, just off Virginia Beach, Virginia, spotted a dark green suitcase floating in the water. When it was pulled from the bay and opened, it held a pair of human legs. 5 days later, a second matching suitcase surfaced, containing further human remains. On May 16th, a third appeared. Together, the 3 pieces of designer luggage held the dismembered remains of a man and the mystery of who he was and how he'd ended up in the water off the Virginia coast, would lead investigators more than 300 miles north to a quiet apartment in Woodbridge, New Jersey. The victim's name was William Maguire, and the person who would ultimately be convicted of killing him was his own wife, a fertility nurse named Melanie. Bill Maguire was 39 years old, a computer programmer who worked at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. He and Melanie had been married since 1999 and were raising 2 young sons in their Woodbridge apartment. To most people who knew them, they looked like a family on the way up. And in the spring of 2004, they were about to take a big step forward. On April 28th, the couple closed on a new, larger home in Warren County, New Jersey. It should have been one of the happiest days of their lives. Instead, it was the last day Bill Maguire was ever seen alive. That night, in the Woodbridge apartment, Bill was killed. He was drugged, then shot twice with a .38 caliber handgun. Afterward, his body was dismembered and packed into a 3-piece set of Kenneth Cole suitcases, the same luggage that would soon wash up in Virginia. When Bill simply vanished, Melanie offered an explanation that, on its surface, fit the story of a rocky marriage. She said the two had gotten into a violent argument in the early morning hours after the closing, that Bill had struck her and ormed out, and that she never saw him again. As far as she was concerned, she suggested, her husband had walked out on his family. For a short time, his disappearance was just that, a missing man, and a wife who said he'd left. But when those suitcases surfaced in the Chesapeake Bay, everything changed. Virginia Beach police, working to identify the remains, released a composite sketch of the dead man, and an acquaintance recognized him as Bill Maguire from New Jersey. Because the murder itself had not happened in Virginia, the investigation was handed off to New Jersey authorities and the state's Attorney General's office. And as detectives began pulling apart the Maguires' lives, the picture that emerged pointed steadily in one direction, toward Melanie. The first thread was motive. Investigators learned that Melanie Maguire had been having an affair with a man named Dr. Bradley Miller, a doctor at the fertility practice where she worked. Melanie admitted to the relationship. The prosecution's theory was that she wanted out of her marriage and into a new life with Miller, and that rather than divorce Bill, she chose to end his life. From there, the evidence only accumulated, and much of it was chillingly deliberate. Just 2 days before the murder, on April 26th, Melanie had purchased a .38 caliber handgun from a shop in Easton, Pennsylvania, the same caliber used to kill Bill. Investigators also uncovered a prescription for chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative, connected to the case, A vial of that same drug was later found in Bill's abandoned car, which had been left in Atlantic City in what looked like an attempt to suggest he'd gone off on his own. Then there was the digital trail, and it was damning. When computer experts examined the Maguires' shared home computer, they found a series of internet searches conducted in the period around Bill's death. Searches for things like how to commit murder, undetectable poisons, and the sedative chloral hydrate. It was the kind of record that is very difficult to explain away. On top of that, forensic analysis tied the physical evidence back to the apartment. An expert testified that the garbage bags used to wrap Bill's remains inside the suitcases matched garbage bags from the Maguires' own home. The case against Melanie Maguire built slowly but steadily over the following year. On June 2, 2005, more than a year after Bill's death, she was arrested and charged with his murder. When the case finally reached trial in the spring of 2007 at the Middlesex County Courthouse in New Brunswick, New Jersey, it became a national sensation. Televised, dissected, and followed across the country, with the media branding Melanie the suitcase killer. The trial ran for roughly 7 weeks. Prosecutors laid out the affair, the gun, the sedative, the internet searches, and the forensic links, arguing that Melanie had used her medical knowledge to plan and carry out a calculated murder. Her defense pushed back hard, contending that she had been an abused wife, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that the real killer was still out there. On April 23, 2007, the jury delivered its verdict. Melanie Maguire was found guilty of first-degree murder, along with desecrating human remains, a weapons offense, and perjury. On July 19, 2007, she was sentenced to life in prison. The judge, Frederick DeVisa, did not mince words, saying the depravity of the murder shocked the conscience of the court. Under the terms of her sentence, Melanie Maguire will not be eligible for parole until she has served roughly 66 years, meaning she would be around 100 years old before she could ever walk free. She remains incarcerated at the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility, New Jersey's women's prison. There is one more dimension to this case that sets it apart, and it deserves to be stated plainly. To this day, Melanie Maguire maintains that she is innocent. In the years since her conviction, she has continued to insist she did not kill her husband, and her case has attracted renewed attention from journalists and advocates who have re-examined the evidence and questioned whether it truly proves her guilt beyond doubt. Those efforts have not changed the outcome. Her appeals and petitions have been unsuccessful, and the conviction stands. But it means that, unlike many cases, the question at the center of this one has never been fully put to rest in the public mind. What is not in dispute is the human tragedy underneath the headlines and the lurid nickname. Bill Maguire was a father of 2 young boys, a man who thought he was about to move his family into a new home. Instead, his life ended that April night, and his sons grew up without him. Whatever anyone believes about the woman convicted of his murder, William Maguire deserves to be remembered as more than the contents of 3 suitcases pulled from the Chesapeake Bay. Heather Barbera, 2018. On the morning of July 8, 2018, a man named Richard Rosen made the drive from Brooklyn, New York down to the Jersey Shore worried. He had been trying to reach his mother and his sister by phone, and neither one was answering. That silence was unlike them. When he arrived at their 8th-floor condominium at Vassar Square, a high-rise right on the boardwalk in Ventnor City, New Jersey, a building with a pool and a popular little breakfast spot downstairs, he let himself in. And inside that seaside home, he found both women dead. His 87-year-old mother, Elaine Rosen, and his 67-year-old sister, Michelle Gordon, had been beaten to death. It would soon become clear that the person responsible was a member of their own family, the woman who lived there with them. She was Michelle's daughter and Elaine's granddaughter, 41-year-old Heather Barbera, and by the time her uncle discovered the bodies, Heather was already gone. To understand how a quiet summer morning at the shore ended in a double homicide, you have to understand the fragile situation inside that condominium. Elaine Rosen and Michelle Gordon were a devoted mother and daughter who shared the Ventnor home. Into that home, they had taken Heather Barbera, Michelle's adult daughter, an unemployed mother of 2 who was, by her own family's account, struggling badly with personal problems and addiction. It was an act of love and generosity, 3 generations of one family under a single roof. But it was also, by several accounts, a strained arrangement. Richard Rosen would later say that he had actually warned his sister against letting Heather move in, sensing that trouble might follow. His warning would prove tragically well-founded. On that July day, inside the condo, a long simmering family conflict boiled over into sudden, catastrophic violence, according to the Ban-Tamam account Heather herself would later give in court. An argument between her and her mother turned physical. She claimed her mother came at her. She described being confronted, and in the version she gave, she grabbed a weapon that happened to be within reach. And that weapon carried a grim significance all its own. It was a nightstick, a wooden police billy club that had belonged to Heather's late father, a man who had served as a police officer in Brooklyn. A tool that had once been carried by a New York City cop, presumably to keep the peace, became the instrument used to kill his widow and his daughter. Heather struck her mother, Michelle, in the head with that nightstick, and when her 87-year-old grandmother, Elaine, tried to intervene, reaching out, trying to grab Heather's arm to stop the assault, Heather turned the weapon on her too, striking the elderly woman repeatedly about the head and body. Both women suffered multiple blunt impact injuries, and both died there in the home they had opened up to her. Whatever spark set off the confrontation, what followed was not a single moment of panic. It was a sustained and brutal attack that left 2 generations of one family dead on the floor of their own condominium. And what Heather Barbera did next revealed the case for what it truly was. She did not call for help. She did not stay. Instead, she took cash, jewelry, and credit cards belonging to her mother, and she left the 2 women where they lay. Then she fled, boarding a bus out of New Jersey and heading for New York City, leaving the bodies to be discovered by whoever came looking. That whoever, as it turned out, would be Richard Rosen, the man who lost his mother and his sister on the same morning, and who had to be the one to find them. For a few days, Heather Barbera was in the wind, somewhere in the sprawl of New York. But the very act that revealed her cold calculation, the robbery, was also what led investigators straight to her. She had taken her victims' credit cards, and when she began using them, those purchases left a trail. Detectives followed that digital breadcrumb trail through the city, and it led them to one of the busiest transit hubs in the world, the Port Authority bus terminal in Midtown Manhattan. There, on July 11, 2018, just 3 days after the killings, Heather Barbera was identified and taken into custody by police. She was later extradited back to New Jersey to face what she had done. The autopsies confirmed the brutality. Reality of the case, both Elaine Rosen and Michelle Gordon had died from multiple blunt impact injuries. Heather Barbera was indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with charges of robbery and possession of a weapon for an unlawful purpose. At first, she pleaded not guilty, and for more than a year the case moved slowly toward a possible trial, with the victim's extended family waiting anxiously for some measure of justice. That resolution came in the fall of 2019. On October 15, 2019, in a courtroom in Mays Landing, New Jersey, a tearful Heather Barbera changed her plea. Rather than force the family through the ordeal of a trial, she admitted her guilt, pleading guilty to first-degree murder in the death of her grandmother, Elaine Rosen, and to aggravated manslaughter in the death of her mother, Michelle Gordon. In entering the plea, she acknowledged the sequence of events aloud, that her grandmother had tried to stop the assault on her mother, and that she had responded by striking the elderly woman repeatedly. The plea was not without controversy. Some of the victims' relatives felt it fell short. A cousin of Elaine and Michelle's called the arrangement a travesty, pointing out the painful arithmetic at its heart, that there had been 2 lives taken, 2 killings, and yet only one of them was being called murder. It's the kind of anguish that a plea deal, however practical, can rarely fully answer. On January 9, 2020, Heather Barbera returned to court to be sentenced. Shackled and in a jail jumpsuit, she apologized through tears, saying she had never wanted any of it to happen. Her defense described her as the product of a toxic family situation, and a lifelong friend stood up to ask the judge for mercy, insisting Heather was not truly a danger. But the prosecution painted a far starker picture, noting that Heather had simply walked away as the 2 women lay dying, and calling it one of the most heinous and depraved crimes imaginable, the killing of one's own mother and grandmother. Atlantic County Superior Court Judge Bernard Delury agreed with the gravity of it, describing Heather's conduct as exceedingly violent and her depravity as palpable. He sentenced her to a total of 42 years in prison, with roughly 40 years to be served before she could even be considered FAS, bar parole, a term that will keep her incarcerated well into her 80s. The case left a deep mark, not just on the family, but on the Ventnor community, where such violence in a peaceful boardwalk high-rise was almost unheard of. But the heaviest weight falls, as it always does, on the people left behind, and on the two women at the center of it. Elaine Rosen and Michelle Gordon were a mother and daughter who, in the last act of their lives, had done something kind. They had taken in a struggling relative and given her a home. That generosity cost them everything, and the man who loved them both, Richard Rosen, was left to carry the unbearable memory of the morning he drove to the shore and found them gone. Tina Lunney, 2009. On July 22, 2009, inside a split-level home on a quiet street in Fairfield, New Jersey, an 81-year-old woman named Marie Zoppi was killed. When her body was discovered the next day, July 23rd, the scene had been carefully arranged to tell a particular story, one meant to make her death look self-inflicted. But that version would not survive even the earliest scrutiny, because the truth was almost the exact opposite of a lonely, private tragedy. Marie Zoppi had been strangled, and the person who killed her, then tried to disguise it, was the daughter she had lived with and trusted for years, Tina Lunney. What drove Lunney to kill her own mother wasn't rage or fear or a moment of passion. It was money. And in the days that followed, she made that motive unmistakable. To understand this case, you have to start with the household, because on the surface it looked like an ordinary, even admirable family arrangement. Marie Zoppi had lived for roughly 14 years in that Fairfield home alongside her daughter Tina, Tina's husband Chris, and the couple's two children. 3 generations under one roof, with an aging mother being looked after by her family in her final years. Tina Lunney presented herself as a respectable suburban woman, a wife, a mother, someone who worked in finance. But behind that presentable exterior, her life was quietly unraveling, and the thread pulling it apart was debt. Tina Lunney had run up enormous financial problems, largely of her own making. She was drowning in debt to collection agencies and creditors. It later came out that she had burned through a $37,000 inheritance that belonged to her husband, and that she had been carrying on a long-running affair, a relationship of about 3 years with a Fairfield police officer. Her finances were collapsing, and she was living a double life, and her elderly mother, Marie, represented something Tina apparently came to see not as a parent to protect, but as a resource to exploit, access to credit, to accounts, to money that could plug the holes Tina had dug. On that July day in 2009, Tina Lunney strangled her mother, using neckties as a ligature. It was a brutal, close, and personal act against a frail, elderly woman, and the medical evidence would later show the sheer force involved, including injury to the ribs. Afterward, rather than call for help, Lunney set about covering her tracks. She arranged the scene and the ligature to make her mother's death look self-inflicted, and she forged a note in Marie's name, left near the body, meant to sell that illusion. Chillingly, she also kept a set of her own handwritten notes tucked away in her handbag, writings that would later work against her. It was a calculated effort to disguise a murder as something it was not, and to walk away clean. But what Tina Lunney did next is what truly exposed the coldness at the heart of this case. With her mother dead, she turned to the thing she had wanted all along. She had, in fact, already been using Marie's credit cards without permission. The family's Outer Banks vacation in North Carolina had been booked on her mother's card before the killing ever happened. Now she kept spending. She used the accounts to buy beach gear for that trip, to pay off around $2,000 owed to the local gas and electric company, and to settle other debts of her own. In the days after strangling her mother, Tina Lunney carried on, shopping for a holiday financed by the woman she had just killed, before eventually fleeing to a casino in Atlantic City. The staged scene was supposed to be the end of the story. Instead, that spending became a glaring trail of evidence pointing directly back to her. Investigators did not take long to see through the staging. The physical evidence at the scene was inconsistent with the self-inflicted story that had been arranged for them, and suspicion turned quickly toward the daughter who had been living with the victim. When confronted, Tina Lunney's carefully built illusion collapsed. Not long after the killing, she admitted the truth. She acknowledged that she had strangled her mother. The scene that had been dressed up as a private tragedy was, by her own admission, a homicide. Despite that early admission, Tina Lunney did not simply accept responsibility and move on. When her case went forward, she pleaded not guilty and took it all the way to trial. The proceedings unfolded in Essex County, and the prosecution's theme was blunt and unwavering. This case, they said, was all about the money. They laid out the mountain of debt, the spent inheritance, the affair, and above all, the almost incomprehensible spectacle of a woman using her murderee. Had mother's credit cards to pay her bills and take a trip. The state's account was of a heartless, calculated killing, a daughter who crushed the life out of her frail, trusting mother purely to escape the financial ruin she herself had created. The defense tried to steer the case in a different direction, suggesting that Tina Lunney's mental state should be a mitigating factor, but the jury was not persuaded. In May of 2013, after roughly a day and a half of deliberation, they found Tina Lunney guilty of murder. Even then, the prosecutors who tried the case remarked on her apparent lack of remorse, noting that she showed no genuine regret throughout the trial, and that even at sentencing she appeared to be trying to convince the judge she was mentally ill in what they viewed as one more attempt at manipulation. On August 13, 2013, the judge, Thomas Moore, delivered a severe punishment, calling the crime heinous. Tina Lunney was sentenced to 40 years in New Jersey State Prison, and under the state's No Early Release Act, she is required to serve 85% of that term, 34 years, before she can even be considered for parole. For a woman in her mid-40s, it is a sentence that ensures she will spend the vast majority of the rest of her life behind bars. She was sent to the Edna Mahan Correctional Facility, the state's prison for women, where her earliest parole eligibility falls in the year 2043, by which point she will be 75 years old. The case drew regional attention and later became the subject of true crime television, in part because of how cleanly it captured a particular kind of horror. Not the crime of a stranger, but the betrayal of a child against a parent, committed not out of desperation for survival, but for credit card debt and a vacation. Prosecutors summed it up in the plainest possible terms, describing Tina Lunney as a heartless killer who took the life of her own frail mother to pay off debts that she and she alone had created. What lingers about this case is the sheer imbalance at its center. Marie Zoppi had done what many parents do. She had grown old within her family, trusting the daughter she lived with to care for her. She was 81 years old in the years of her life when she should have been safest. Instead, she died at the hands of that daughter, and her final gift to her family, her credit, her accounts, whatever she had, was stolen to fund a getaway in the days after her death. Tina Lunney tried to make the world believe her mother had chosen to die. The evidence, and eventually her own words, made clear that the choice had been Tina's alone. Raquel Garajau, 2016. On the morning of February 22, 2017, a park ranger was clearing litter along Gully Road in Shark River Park, a wooded county preserve in Wall Township, New Jersey. Just off the roadway, down a slight slope, the ranger noticed something that didn't belong. It was the body of a man. Police from Wall Township were called to the scene a little after 8:30 that morning, and they confirmed what the ranger had found: a deceased young man left in the woods. He was identified as Trupal Patel, 28 years old, from nearby Brick Township. He had been shot, and the investigation into who killed him and why would lead detectives not to a hardened criminal underworld, but to a 19-year-old college honors student from a comfortable suburb. A young woman who, prosecutors would come to argue, was the true mastermind behind his death. To understand the case, you have to understand who Trupal Patel was. Patel sold marijuana, and he'd had prior run-ins with the law for it, but by every account, he was not a dangerous or violent man. Investigators and those who knew him described him as friendly, generous, and easygoing, the kind of low-key neighborhood dealer who sold mostly to suburban customers and never intimidated anyone. When word spread that he'd been killed, the people who knew him were genuinely shocked. He wasn't the sort of person anyone expected to end up dead in a park, and that made the question of who would want him dead all the more puzzling, at least at first. The answer lay with two young people who, on paper, seemed to have bright futures ahead of them. The first was Joseph Villani, a 20-year-old from Ocean Township. The second was his girlfriend, Raquel Garajau of Tinton Falls, a 19-year-old honors student at Brookdale Community College. To the outside world, Garajau was a bright, accomplished young woman. But behind that image, according to the case prosecutors built, she and Villani had hatched a cold and simple plan: to rob Trupal Patel of his marijuana and his cash, and to kill him in the process. On February 6, 2017, the plan was set in motion. Patel was lured to Joseph Villani's home in Ocean Township under the pretense of an ordinary marijuana sale. He believed he was simply going there to sell to a customer. Instead, in the garage of that home, Villani shot Patel 3 times with a .22 caliber Marlin rifle. Patel was killed, and the pair took what they'd come for: his drugs, his cash, and his possessions, including a distinctive watch. Then, to get rid of the evidence of what they'd done, they wrapped up the aftermath, and Villani drove Patel's body to Shark River Park, where he left it in the woods off Gully Road, the same spot where a park ranger would stumble upon it more than 2 weeks later. For a short time, the killing looked like it might go unsolved. Patel had no obvious enemies, and there was no clear trail, but the investigation caught a break when a friend of Villani's came forward with information about Patel's car, which had been abandoned and moved in an effort to buy time. That thread led detectives toward Villani, and through him, toward Raquel Garajau. Villani was arrested for the murder on February 25, 2017, just days after the body was found. And when the two were initially charged, both told the same story, that Patel's death had been an act of self-defense, a drug deal that had somehow gone wrong. But that account did not hold up, because the case against them was not built on speculation. It was built on their own words, thousands of them. When investigators examined the cell phones belonging to Garajau and Villani, they uncovered a trove of text messages exchanged between the couple around the time of the killing, and those messages painted a devastating picture. Far from being an innocent bystander or a girlfriend who merely got caught up in something, Garajau appeared in her own texts to be directing the cover-up with chilling composure. She told Villani to clean the bullets. She instructed him to take your time bleaching everything, the whole entire door and inside. She coordinated the disposal of evidence, writing about throwing items into the ocean because she had touched the victim's phone, and pressing Villani to move Patel's car quickly before people noticed he was missing. And, in perhaps the most haunting detail of all, as Villani was in the act of disposing of Patel's body, Garajau texted him asking him to FaceTime me please when you are done, and told him, I love you. To them, Garajau was not a follower, but a driving force, the person coolly managing the aftermath, disposing of evidence, and sharing in the spoils. And notably, even Villani himself at various points told detectives that Garajau had nothing to do with Patel's death, an attempt to shield her that the physical and digital evidence flatly contradicted. The two were tried separately, and Raquel Garajau's case went before a Monmouth County jury first. Her trial began in the summer of 2018 and stretched on for nearly 2 months, featuring 35 witnesses and a mountain of forensic and digital evidence. In September of 2018, the jury reached its verdict. On the charge of intentional, purposeful murder, they acquitted her. They were not convinced she had personally planned for Patel to die. But they found her guilty of first-degree felony murder, the legal principle that holds someone responsible for a killing that occurs during the commission of a serious felony, in this case, the armed robbery. Alongside that, she was convicted on roughly a dozen more counts: conspiracy, armed robbery, theft, weapons offenses, tampering with evidence, hindering apprehension, and desecrating human remains. Whatever the jury believed about her intent, they concluded she was a full participant in the robbery that cost Trupal Patel his life. the honor student image had collapsed entirely. On July 1, 2019, Garajau returned to the Freehold Courthouse to be sentenced. Superior Court Judge Joseph Oxley handed down a term of 33 years in prison. Under the No Early Release Act, she must serve 85% of that sentence, 30 years, before she can even be considered for release, and she would then face 5 years of parole supervision. At the sentencing, the judge pointedly noted Garajau's apparent lack of remorse for her role in the killing. Her boyfriend, Joseph Villani, the one who pulled the trigger, had by then already resolved his own case. He pleaded guilty to aggravated manslaughter, armed robbery, conspiracy, and disturbing human remains, and in the spring of 2019, months before Garajau's sentencing, he was sentenced to 40 years in state prison, required under New Jersey's No Early Release Act to serve. 85% of that term, roughly 34 years, before he could be considered for parole. Both young people, who once seemed to have everything ahead of them, would spend the heart of their lives behind bars. The case drew wide attention, and later became the subject of true crime television, precisely because it defied expectation. There was no obvious monster here, just a well-regarded college student and her boyfriend who decided that another young man's life was worth less than a stash of marijuana and some cash. Trupal Patel was 28 years old. Whatever his own brushes with the law, he was, to the people who knew him, a gentle and generous person who never saw the betrayal coming, lured to his death by the promise of an ordinary transaction. And the young woman most responsible for orchestrating the cover-up did it all while calmly texting the words, "I love you," to the man carrying out her plan. It's a case that stands as a stark reminder that appearances, honor rolls, clean records, promising futures, can conceal something far colder underneath. Latonia Bellamy, 2010. At around 3 o'clock in the morning on April 4, 2010, on Randolph Avenue in Jersey City, New Jersey, a young couple pulled up outside their home. They had every reason to be happy. Just hours earlier, Michael Mucciocchi and Nia Hawk, college sweethearts, both in their 20s, had celebrated their engagement, surrounded by the people who loved them. They were going to be married, but they never made it inside. In the darkness outside their own front door, the couple was ambushed, robbed, and shot to death. Within a few short hours, a night that had begun with a celebration of their future ended with both of them gone. And one of the 3 people who would be convicted of taking their lives was a young woman named Latonia Bellamy. To understand the sheer senselessness of this crime, you have to hold on to who the victims were. Michael Mucciocchi was 27, Nia Hawk was 25. They had met and fallen in love, and by the spring of 2010, they had reached one of the happiest milestones a young couple can share. They were engaged to be married. On the night of April 3rd, they held an engagement party, a gathering to mark the beginning of their life together. When it ended, they did what countless couples do. They drove home, pulling up to their residence on Randolph Avenue in the small hours of the morning, tired and happy, with no idea that anyone was waiting for them. What they didn't know was that 3 people were out that night looking for someone to rob. Latonia Bellamy was one of them. With her were her cousin, Shaquan Bellamy, and a woman named Darmelia Lawrence. The trio had come together with robbery on their minds, and Latonia, by her own later account, had expressed a chilling interest before the night was over. She had told the others that she wanted to fire a gun. When Michael Mucciocchi and Nia Hawk arrived home in Stepson, pet out of their vehicle, they became the targets. The couple offered no resistance. They were confronted, forced to the ground, and robbed. And then, despite their compliance, the shooting began. What happened in those moments is difficult to hear. Michael Mucciocchi was shot and killed, and Nia Hawk, according to the account established at trial, was shot by Latonia Bellamy, who fired at the young woman at her cousin's direction before Shaquan took the weapon and finished the killing. 2 people who had done nothing but come home from their own engagement party were executed on the street outside their door for the contents of their pockets and a vehicle. The killers took what they could and fled into the night, leaving the couple behind. The discovery of Michael and Nia's bodies sent a wave of grief and outrage through Jersey City. Here were two accomplished, well-loved young people on the threshold of marriage, gunned down in an act of pure predation. The pressure to find whoever was responsible was immense, and investigators went to work piecing together the final hours of the couple's lives and the movements of those who had crossed their path that night. The investigation led them to the three people who had been out hunting for a robbery target: Latonia Bellamy, Chiquan Bellamy, and Darmelia Lawrence. And one by one, they were identified, arrested, and charged in connection with the double murder. The evidence against them was substantial. After her arrest, Latonia Bellamy gave a statement to police describing what had happened that night, including the account that Chiquan had shot Michael and that she herself had fired at Nia before Chiquan took the gun back. That admission, combined with the broader investigation, formed the backbone of the case. The three defendants were prosecuted for their roles, and their cases moved through the Hudson County court system. Latonia Bellamy stood trial, and in June of 2012, a jury found her guilty. The verdict reflected the layered nature of her responsibility under New Jersey law. For the death of Michael Mucciocchi, she was convicted of felony murder, the principle that holds a participant accountable for a killing that occurs during a serious felony, in this case the armed robbery and carjacking. For the death of Nia Haq, the victim she herself had fired upon, she was convicted of murder. She was also found guilty of robbery, carjacking, and a weapons offense. Her two co-defendants were likewise convicted for their parts in the crime. Her cousin Chiquan Bellamy received a sentence of life plus 30 years, and Darmelia Lawrence was sentenced to 20 years. Latonia Bellamy's own sentence would take a longer and more complicated road. She was originally sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but years later, in 2021, a state appeals court took up her case. The court affirmed her conviction, meaning her guilt was not in question, but it sent the matter of her sentence back to the lower court, directing that the judge reconsider certain records and factors, including those related to her youth and background at the time of the crime. Bellamy had been 19 years old when the murders occurred, and questions about how the law should weigh the youth of an offender have become an increasingly significant issue in courts across the country. That review led to a resentencing in 2024. In the end, the outcome was severe. Latonia Bellamy received a total term of roughly 70 years in prison. The structure was layered: a 30-year sentence for the felony murder of Michael Mucciocchi, to be served without parole, and a consecutive 40-year term for the murder of Nia Haq, subject to New Jersey's No Early Release Act, along with concurrent time for the robbery, carjacking, and weapons charges. The practical result is stark. Under the terms of that sentence, Latonia Bellamy will not be eligible for parole until she has served 64 years behind bars, a term that, for all practical purposes, means she will spend the rest of her life in prison. The case has never fully faded from memory in Jersey City, in part because of the profound unfairness at its heart. Michael Mucciocchi and Nia Haq were not caught up in anything dangerous. They had no connection to their killers. They were simply a young couple in love, coming home from the party where they celebrated their engagement, when they crossed paths with three people who had decided that someone was going to be robbed that night. The couple complied with every demand, and they were killed anyway. Their families were left to mourn not only the two people they lost, but the entire future that had been stolen, the wedding that would never happen, the marriage that would never begin. More than a decade later, all three of those responsible remain behind bars. And while the courts have delivered their verdicts and their sentences, nothing about the outcome can undo the essential tragedy of the case. That two young people, at one of the most joyful moments of their lives, were murdered on their own doorstep by strangers who valued their belongings more than their lives. Elizabeth Mascarelli, 2024. On July 5, 2024, police descended on a home on Ravenwood Drive in Toms River, New Jersey. They had come for a man named Maxwell Johnston, who was wanted in the killing of a young woman days earlier, and who they believed was hiding inside. What followed was a tense standoff that stretched on for the better part of 7 hours. But when it was over and investigators were able to piece together what had been happening inside that house, they uncovered something no one had come looking for. The home's own owner, a 56-year-old man named Kerry Rollison, had already been murdered, 2 days before the police ever arrived. His body was gone. And the person who had fired the shots that killed him was a 29-year-old woman who had been living under his roof, named Elizabeth Mascarelli. To understand this case, you have to understand the troubled household that had formed inside Kerry Rollison's Toms River home. Rollison owned the house on Ravenwood Drive, and he had taken in tenants, Elizabeth Mascarelli among them, along with several other people. By the summer of 2024, that home had become the center of a world of drugs and instability. The people living there were, by the account prosecutors later gave, dealing and using illegal substances, and the household was volatile. Kerry Rollison, the man who owned the home and had opened it to these tenants, would become the victim of the very chaos unfolding under his own roof. The killing itself took place on or about July 3, 2024. Inside the Ravenwood Drive home, Elizabeth Mascarelli shot Kerry Rollison 3 times. What makes this case so chilling is not only the killing, but the coldness of what came afterward. Rather than any sign of panic or remorse, Mascarelli and her housemates left the house and went to a McDonald's. A detail that, once revealed, stunned the community. Then the eyes returned. And back at the home, with the help of others in the house, Rollison's body was dismembered in an effort to dispose of it. We won't describe those details. It's enough to say that the concealment of the crime was as calculated as it was gruesome. The remains were then transported out of Toms River and discarded on property in neighboring Jackson Township. For a couple of days, the crime stayed hidden. Kerry Rollison was simply gone, and no one outside that house knew what had happened to him. What brought it all to light was a separate tragedy entirely. Days earlier, on June 27th, a 25-year-old woman named Gabriella Caroleo had been killed in nearby Manchester. As she lay dying, she was able to name her attacker, a man named Maxwell Johnston. Johnston went on the run, and in the days that followed he found somewhere to hide, Kerry Rollison's home on Ravenwood Drive, where Mascarelli and the others let him stay. So when law enforcement tracked Johnston to that address on July 5th, they arrived believing they were closing in on a murder suspect in the Caroleo case, with no idea that a second killing had already taken place inside those very walls. As officers surrounded the home, 3 of the people inside came out and were taken into custody. But Johnston, who was armed, refused to surrender, and Elizabeth Mascarelli remained inside with him. The standoff dragged on for hours before Mascarelli finally emerged, injured, and was taken to a hospital. Johnston died inside of a self-inflicted gunshot wound before he could be arrested. It was in the aftermath, as detectives searched the house and interviewed those who had been living there, that everything unraveled. The disappearance of the homeowner, Kerry Rollison, came into focus, and the story his tenants told did not hold together. The investigation moved quickly from there. On July 12, 2024, Kerry Rollison's remains were located on the property in Jackson Township, along with physical evidence that told the grim story of how his body had been concealed, including a hatchet. And as investigators worked the case, a piece of evidence emerged that would come to define it in the public mind. On Elizabeth Mascarelli's own phone, detectives found a photograph, an image of the hatchet embedded in Rollison's body. Prosecutors would later describe it as a trophy photo, something Mascarelli appeared to take a disturbing pride in. It transformed the case from a killing born of a chaotic, drug-fueled household into something colder and more deliberate. Mascarelli was initially taken into custody on July 5th, in the immediate aftermath of the standoff, and she was formally served with an array of charges days later, including desecration of human remains and weapons offenses. As the investigation continued, the full picture came together, that Elizabeth Mascarelli was the person responsible for Kerry Rollison's death, and that she and several housemates had assisted in dismembering his body and disposing of it in Jackson Township. In October of 2024, a grand jury indicted her on charges including murder and conspiracy to commit murder. 3 other people connected to the household were indicted for their roles in concealing the crime: Jared Krisiak, Danielle Bolstad, and Jared Palumbo. Investigators determined that Mascarelli, Krisiak, and Bolstad had dismembered Rollison's body, and that those three, along with Palumbo, had helped move his remains to Jackson Township. Krysiak would later plead guilty to desecration of human remains and face an 8-year sentence. Facing a murder charge that could have sent her to prison for life, Elizabeth Mascarelli reached a resolution with the state. On December 9, 2024, she appeared before Superior Court Judge Guy Ryan and pleaded guilty, not to murder, but to the lesser charge of aggravated manslaughter, which under New Jersey law means recklessly causing a death under circumstances showing extreme indifference to human life. In admitting to that charge, she acknowledged that she was the person responsible for Carrie Rollison's death, and the state agreed to seek a term of 25 years. Her sentencing took place on January 31, 2025. In the courtroom, Mascarelli offered an apology to Carrie Rollison's loved ones, telling them that nothing could justify what had happened and that she was sorry, though she acknowledged that no apology could give the family closure. For Rollison's relatives, that was cold comfort. A prosecutor speaking on the family's behalf said the horrific facts of the case would deprive them of closure forever, and that they were not satisfied Mascarelli would ever truly grasp the gravity of what she had done. The gruesome nature of the case was so overwhelming that, according to reporting from the hearing, one family member watching by video link signed off rather than continue listening. The prosecutor summed it up bluntly, saying the facts read like the plot of a horror movie, that a person had to suspend their sense of reality to accept that something so inhumane could happen there in Ocean County. Judge Ryan sentenced Elizabeth Mascarelli to 25 years in New Jersey State Prison. Under the state's No Early Release Act, she is required to serve 85% of that term, roughly 21 years, before she can be considered for parole. She will be well into middle age before she has any chance at freedom. The case left a deep unease over Tom's River, a shore community unaccustomed to violence of this kind, and beneath the shocking headlines about the McDonald's trip and the trophy photograph, there is a simpler and sadder core to the story. Carrie Rollison was a 56-year-old man who owned a home and made the ordinary decision to rent out rooms in it. In doing so, he opened his door to the people who would ultimately take his life and treat his body as something to be disposed of. He deserved to be more than a footnote in a case that only came to light because police had come looking for someone else entirely. The cases in this documentary crossed all of New Jersey, from a fertility nurse in a comfortable Woodbridge apartment to a boardwalk high-rise in Ventnor, to a split-level home in Fairfield, to the streets of Jersey City and the shore towns of Ocean County. Different places, different people, different reasons: money, jealousy, debt, drugs, and cold calculation. But look closely, and the same thread runs through nearly all of them. The danger didn't come from a stranger in the dark. It came from inside the home: a wife, a daughter, a granddaughter, a partner, a tenant, the people who were supposed to be safe to let in. That's what these cases left behind in New Jersey. Not just headlines and prison sentences, but a quiet unease in the kinds of ordinary places where people assumed things like this simply didn't happen. A luxury resort, a retirement condo, a family home, a college campus. But through all of it, we never want to lose sight of who this is really about. Behind every one of these stories is a person who didn't come home. They were more than the worst thing that ever happened to them, and they deserve to be remembered. Now we want to hear from you. Of these cases, which one disturbed you the most, and which one stayed with you long after it ended? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and the conversations down there are some of the best on this channel. And if there's a New Jersey case or a case from your own state that you think we should cover next, drop the name below. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for spending this time with us. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new documentary. We release true crime stories like these every week. Until next time, take care of yourselves and stay safe out there.